And we have a mic for you.
So you can get an extra star.
Very good.
Thank you so much. I'll let you get back.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I want to welcome you here today. I'm Joanne Britton, and we're glad that you're here for this next episode of our Fall Variety Pack. Today, we're very happy to welcome Gene Wubbels, who taught at Grinnell College and at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Today, he's going to talk to us about the political science of dietary fat. Please welcome Gene Wubbels.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear? Very good. It's a great honor to be here today. Joyce and I have been welcomed back to Grinnell by many of you in this room, not least Sue and George Drake, who are the namesakes of this building that we're meeting in. So it's a real pleasure to be among you. My professional background is in organic chemistry and biological chemistry. It is not in nutrition, nor medicine, nor political science. And I thought at the start I should say a little bit about that term in my title, political science. It doesn't say that the topic of fat has anything to do with the discipline of political science. It, however, tries to say that the science of dietary fat has been a profoundly political doing. So that's the meaning of the word up there. My interest in this subject was piqued by a front page article in the journal Science of 2001 by Gary Taubes entitled The Soft Science of Dietary Fat. It reported that in 1987, the United States Surgeon General's office published a 700-page report on nutrition and health. This report declared that fat is the most unhealthy component of our diet. Some readers noticed, however, that the Surgeon General had not identified any scientific basis for this claim. So he hustled about, and the next year he set up one of these famous blue ribbon panels of distinguished experts to summarize the scientific basis for this claim. We didn't hear anything from them for 11 years. Whereupon the successor Surgeon General in 1999 quietly announced that he was dismissing this blue ribbon panel. He explained that the requisite studies and scientific consensus on the harmful effects of dietary fat could not be identified. The landmark report was not retracted, however. Now, this is what you call a head-turning event. I was a lonely organic chemist when I read this, and I thought, what's going on here? This isn't anything like what I thought should be happening. This is government at the highest level, which is saying that they proceeded with this report with no attention to the science, or at least inadequate attention to it. So that's going to be the reason for the talk today and some studies that I've done along those lines. There is a superb book, by the way, that I'm indebted to for this lecture called The Big Fat Surprise, published in 2014 by Nina Teicholz, and I strongly recommend that book for interested readers. About 100 million Americans suffer from something called Syndrome X. It's also called metabolic syndrome. Its symptoms are abdominal obesity, high serum fats and glucose, low serum HDL cholesterol, a pre-diabetes kind of condition, and high blood pressure. Meanwhile, the advice from all governmental and health authorities for the last 60 years approximately has been to eat a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. Well, more about the probable connections of the syndrome. I noticed in the Omaha World Herald last year that diabetes has increased 400% since 1990. Obesity globally has increased by 600% since 1975, that's according to Time magazine. And then we get to this advice. The question is there any relationship between these two developments? That is, the huge advance of this syndrome X and those diseases, they are actually the leading public health diseases at this time in our country, and this dietary advice. Well, we'll see. All of this advice stems from something called the diet-heart hypothesis. This was first put forward in 1950. I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. But this claims that dietary fat is, especially saturated fat, raises the risk of heart disease. And it is significant that this diet-heart hypothesis lacks scientific support, despite the investment of billions of dollars in research on the subject. This advice of 60 years ago is being repeated today. So here is from the American Heart Association. They issued a 24-page presidential advisory that has the look of a scientific paper in June 2017. Here's a quotation from that publication. It says, "The scientific rationale for decreasing saturated fat in the diet has been since 1961 and remains based on well-established effects of saturated fat to raise LDL cholesterol, a leading cause of atherosclerosis." I was interested by reference 4. Turns out that reference 4 doesn't say anything like that. I'll tell you more about reference 4 a little later in the talk. We also read from the Mayo Clinic a special report on aging in August last. Mayo Clinic is a not insignificant source of authority on diet and health, but here's what they say. A healthy diet includes a foundation of minimally processed plant foods, and if you eat animal-based foods, implying that you really shouldn't, choose lean protein sources such as fat-free dairy and lean meats such as chicken and fish. Also, Consumer Reports had a special on health issued in July. They say, "Leave coconut oil to the monkeys. It's 90% bad saturated fat. This increases the risk of heart disease. You want good unsaturated fat to turn on your heart-healthy switches." Almost all of this is nonsense. And no one has ever figured out what heart-healthy switches might be. They certainly don't exist. Okay, so turning to our subject, one way to classify nutrition is to look at macronutrients in the diet and micronutrients. Macronutrients are the ones that are responsible for our calories. In a typical diet, carbohydrates, sugars, and starches account for about 50% of calories. fat about 40%, and protein about 10% of calories. One of the take-home messages about this is that if you follow the advice to decrease fat in the diet, it is ineluctable that you will have to increase the amount of carbohydrate. Why? Because you can't make up those calories with protein. You don't want to eat that much protein, so you have to do it with the other macronutrient carbohydrate. As we sometimes say in science, there is no such thing as a free lunch. The micronutrients are another important part. They don't provide calories to speak of. Vitamins, minerals, and the essentials. There are amino acids that are essential, and also some fatty acids that are essential. Notice there aren't any essential carbohydrates. This diet heart hypothesis was put forward in the 1950s by a man named Ansel Keys, who was a physiologist in the medical school of the University of Minnesota. Keys was a competitive and domineering scientist who was excessively fond of advancing his own ideas. He seemed unaware of the obligation of a scientist to seek the truth, to use unbiased samples, and to try to prove one's own ideas false before you advance them. Keys argued his hypotheses ceaselessly, and he dealt, as you will hear later, arrogantly and ruthlessly with dissent. These character flaws and his ability to align himself with power were crucial in the developments that followed. So a little bit more science. You probably have heard somewhere that oil and water do not mix. We observe this often when we take out our oil and vinegar salad dressing. The aqueous layer with the vinegar sinks to the bottom and the oil floats on top. That means that occurs because these two fluids do not dissolve in each other. The ones that don't dissolve among the nutrients are called lipids. Those are oil-soluble substances. So, and a really important one is cholesterol. You probably have only negative feelings about cholesterol, but you shouldn't. Cholesterol is actually a quite large amount in our blood, about 20 grams or so. Each of us is carrying around in just our blood. And it's used for construction of membranes and especially nervous tissue. Another lipid are the fats. Here's a chemical structure, by the way, you don't need to, we won't give you a quiz about this, but those are called the bond line representation of the molecule. Each of the corners or the short lines ending in space represent a carbon atom, and the lines in between are the chemical bonds between the carbons. None of the hydrogens that are attached are shown. Same with this fat structure. It is a fat molecule has the general shape in which this piece here comes from the trialcohol called glycerol or glycerin. When it is esterified that is bonded to this is a fatty acid. And fat will have 3 of these fatty acid chains. This one is showing 3. And they may be the same or different. So this one has the most common fatty acid chain called palmitic acid if it's separated. And it's a 16 carbon long chain. This one is also common, especially in beef. Beef tallow, that's stearic acid, that's 18 carbons long. Fatty acids can have anywhere from 12 to 18, with 16 and 18 being most common. Those two are also called saturated. because the carbon chain along here has as much hydrogen attached to it as it can have. It's saturated with hydrogen. Here's an example of an unsaturated one. This is oleic acid. That's the main fat in olive oil. And oleic acid has this structural feature, a double bond in the carbon chain. This one, as all natural ones are, is called cis, because the attachments of the double bond to the chain are on the same side of the double bond. If it's on the opposite side, it is called trans, and those are nasty ones that I'll explain a little bit about in a second. One curious feature, around that double bond, the atoms attached all lie in a plane. So wherever there's a cis double bond, it ensures that there's a kink in the chain. That means that these unsaturated fats that have one or more of these in them don't pile up neatly on each other, and they tend to be liquids at room temperature. So olive oil, coconut oil, and so on, those are all primarily unsaturated oils, and they are liquids because of that structural feature. If a fat is entirely these saturated side chains, then they tend to be solids at room temperature. So predominantly saturated fats like lard, butter, and beef tallow, they have a majority saturated fats in these side chains, and they are solid, and it's because these line up neatly all together and pack to make a solid. Here's something we'll talk about a little bit later in some detail. This is a natural fat with a cis double bond, and you can hydrogenate it. This is done with hydrogen over a precious metal catalyst like platinum, and it will absorb hydrogen at the double bond and convert it into a saturated fat if it goes as expected. When you do a partial hydrogenation, however, you get some of it going this way, and you stop about halfway, and at that point some of this that is sat down on the catalyst pops back off, but it pops back off the catalyst as trans. There isn't any way, because you're dealing with thermodynamics here, to avoid this. So if you do a partial hydrogenation to make something like margarine, you want to produce things that make the fat solid, and that is particularly good at making a fat solid. But you don't want to go all the way, because then they'll be converted to saturated fats. But if you stop halfway, then you get this trans double bond in there. And that's the nasty one. More about trans fats in a little while. Okay. Okay, these fats and cholesterol are insoluble in water, and therefore they're insoluble in blood. So they need to have something to carry them around. These are called lipoproteins. There are different classes of lipoproteins that you've probably heard of. LDLs, HDLs, and VLDLs are the three most common. There are more than that. And there's, we know more about these carriers than implied by just those three categories. This is called the bad cholesterol. So, excuse me. Because it carries cholesterol from the liver to the peripheral tissues. And the peripheral tissues is where you can get plaques that clog the arteries. This is called the good cholesterol because it carries cholesterol in the other direction, from the peripheral tissues back to the liver. The VLDL particles are actually LDLs like that, but they have been loaded up with fats as well. So if the LDLs are loaded with that, you call them VLDLs if they have fat with them. The total serum cholesterol that you all have some understanding of is the sum of the concentrations of all three of these lipoproteins. Okay. Now, the diet heart hypothesis, I said, was put forward by Ansel Keys, so we're going to center on him and his work. It wasn't Keys who discovered cholesterol in these human arterial plaques. Plaques can be identified after death, pulled out, extracted, and people found cholesterol in them. And they thought, I bet it has something to do with cholesterol in the blood, which was being discovered about that same time. So maybe the level of blood cholesterol is affecting the amount of cholesterol deposited in arteries. So Keys thought about this and then decided that he would do some feeding experiments on 66 men in a hospital for schizophrenics in Minnesota beginning in 1952. I must say that it's probable that these are ethically challenged experiments that probably would not be permitted today because these men could not give their assent to the procedures. He concluded, by the way, large amounts of dietary fat caused elevation of serum cholesterol. These were short-term experiments, not much data, but that's what he concluded. And this led him to make this diet heart hypothesis. Fats are causing high blood pressure, high blood cholesterol, which in turn is causing atherosclerosis. A reasonable question was also, does cholesterol in the diet then end up as blood cholesterol? Well, in 1913, a Russian fellow showed that atherosclerotic plaques could be induced in rabbits by feeding them large amounts of cholesterol. Later, this was repeated with many other herbivores, such as sheep, cattle, and horses. But when they tried it with dogs, they didn't get the plaques. Well, why is this? Well, the theory was maybe the herbivores aren't designed to handle cholesterol because they didn't evolve eating cholesterol, but dogs did. So that's why dogs can eat cholesterol and not get plaques and the herbivores don't. Okay, that's a pretty reasonable theory, but nonetheless, despite scanty evidence, the idea of plaques being related to dietary cholesterol still was there. So Ansel Keys subscribed to this theory, and then he and others carried out feeding experiments on the schizophrenic men again in 1952. They found that eating 8 to 15 eggs per day for weeks had no effect on the concentration of serum cholesterol. Isn't that stunning? In 1955, Keys himself said, "This point, control of serum cholesterol through diet, requires no further consideration." Can you believe that this was resolved in 1955? How many people do you know who approach the banquet table saying, "Oh, too much cholesterol for me, I'm not going to eat that eggy thing"? And they feel virtuous when they eat foods labeled cholesterol-free. There's no scientific basis to this day to avoiding dietary cholesterol in order to decrease your serum cholesterol. Okay, Keys was attacked for his scanty data on schizophrenic men, and so decided to do another study, which he did, published in 1952, showing for 6 different countries around the world, the relationship between fat calories as percent of total calories, so the more fat you get, the further up that axis you go, and mortality from degenerative heart disease, whatever that is. And he got these lines. That's for one age group, and here's another one. Notice Japan is way over here. Japan's always way over there. And the reason in part is because, look at the date, 1948 to 49. Things were pretty tough in Japan. They weren't eating like very much, and it was almost all rice, but not much rice. So they always end up with very low death rates from heart disease and very low percentages of fat as total. Well, so 6-country study. Here you have these nice curves showing that there's a correlation. Key word, correlation. There's the hypothesis again, and it's based on epidemiological research, in this case, which aims to find a correlation between two properties of a set of observations or a population. It can show association, but not cause. So, for example, you can get an almost perfect correlation between thunder and the incidence of rain. But does that prove that thunder causes rain? Well, no. Okay, that's an example of the difference between an association and cause. Here's another interesting one. John Yudkin published in The Lancet, that's a medical journal, in 1957, his theory that radio and television cause coronary heart disease. So this is the number of radio and TV licenses. I think that is synonymous with people getting a radio or TV, but I'm not sure. There are millions of them anyway. And on this axis is put mortality from heart disease, coronary heart disease, here. Well, okay, so you see a little hiccup here for World War II, which you'd expect, in both graphs. In fact, it looks like these two are very closely associated. So be careful with your radio and TV if you want to avoid heart disease. Okay, back to life in the Midwest in 1952. In my hometown, Preston, Minnesota. Are you cooking with Crisco and sudsing with draft? Who can state the next sentence? No, you don't want to put it together. Anybody know what followed that? This is Cedric Adams with your noontime news. Sue, you knew that, didn't you? Okay, WCCO Radio in Minneapolis was a big radio station, still is, and it reaches about 5-state region in the Midwest. Crisco and Draft were new products of the Procter & Gamble company. Wonderful products, by the way. And instructions for using Crisco, my wife Joyce has told me that I shouldn't really talk about the Betty Crocker cookbook giving instructions for Crisco, because Crisco was not made by General Mills, and so they probably use words like vegetable shortening. But nonetheless, my mother swore by Crisco, and she also swore by the Betty Crocker cookbook. So we ate lots and lots of stuff, including Crisco, in the cooking and baking in the Wubbels family when I was a kid. This was the beginning of a massive change in diets. So the change occurred starting about 1950s, and one of the biggest elements of that change was the nature of the fats. Crisco is partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. Crisco contained 22% trans fat. Let me repeat that. Crisco contained 22% trans fat. How many gallons of Crisco did I eat in my life as a youngster? A lot. And margarine, same sort of thing. A little different fat was used to start with, but margarine too was a partially hydrogenated vegetable oil which contained trans fats in about 20%. Moving on, a fellow named Jacob Yerushalmi was in the biostatistics department of the University of California at Berkeley, and he read Key's 6 countries study, and he thought it was suspicious. He thought it was contrived, and that the data were pretty vague. So Yerushalmi and Hilbo, his associate, did the same sort of study, but they looked for 22 countries. That's all the countries in the world they could find that had national data available on fat calories as percentage of total, which they could estimate from the dietary information that was available, and also mortality. So Yerushalmi published this graph, and you can see that the idea that there's a linear relationship here between mortality from heart problems and fat calories is pretty random. Notice 2 outliers. What do you think that dot was for? Japan. As I said, Japan is always over there, and that is because of the set of anomalies that exist in Japan for their eating, especially at this time. This is the other one that is close to an outlier. That's the United States. The United States was unique in that it was very little disrupted by this, plus it was a leader in the trans fat eating movement. So if you were to just take that point out and that point out and look at the rest of them, this is pretty much the impact of a shotgun blast. That means no correlation is evident here. Even if you leave them in, the correlation is pretty shabby. So, that was a criticism of Keyes, which Keyes did not like. But then it was brought up to him that there have been, through the ages, a whole lot of studies of unique peoples in the world and what they ate. George Mann studied a lot of things in this area, including a tribe called the Maasai in Africa. And these were herders, and they ate nothing but meat, blood, and milk. A lot of milk, like 1 gallon per day. They had robust heart health, no heart attacks. Stephenson, way back in the 30s, studied the Inuit and the Eskimos of the Arctic. Fat was prized for these people. They didn't eat very many vegetables for the obvious reason that they couldn't grow them there, and there weren't any fruits either. So they ate the fattest parts of the caribou and seals that they could find, and the lean meat they regarded as refuse, which they fed to the dogs. When challenged about this, that these people couldn't possibly be that healthy eating this stuff, he decided, well, I'm going to show myself. So with a colleague, he checked into Bellevue Hospital, and under supervision in the hospital for 3 weeks, he ate nothing but meat and water. He and a colleague. And after observing him for 3 weeks and figuring out that he wasn't probably going to die right away, they let him go home, and he continued this diet for a year. And after that, he emerged in perfect health. A guy named Shaper studied another tribe in Africa, in Uganda, called the Sambus. Their diet is mainly milk, averaging about 1 pound of butter fat per day. And meat, their blood pressure was measured, weights, they were all about 50% lower than comparable Americans. Harrison looked at railroad workers in India in the north and south, and again found these north people had diets rich in dairy and were in robust health. Workers in the south ate mainly vegetarian rice diet, and they experienced poor health. Lecca studied the Navajo and Hopi in the United States. Same story. Animal diets high in saturated fats, no cardiac disease, good health, long lives, and no tooth decay. Okay, so this was thrown up to Keyes. Keyes didn't like this. He sniffed the peculiarities of these, this is a quote, peculiarities of those primitive nomads have no relevance to health in the modern world. Okay. The amazing thing is he got that to stick somehow. I'll tell you why later. This was about the time that his picture appeared on the cover of Time magazine. So this is the making of a celebrity in this area. And this very stern-looking man is surrounded by a man here with a little bit of a pot who's standing on a scale, measuring himself, and then a diagram of the heart and the arteries and veins connected to it. So, he was hailed here as the savior of the country for the wonderful things he was doing. So Keyes came back fighting and got the NIH to fund a major study which comes to be known as the 7 countries study. Here are the main results from the 7 countries study. Shows a pretty good correlation between diet calories from saturated fat and heart disease deaths. See, there isn't a line shown here, but there's probably a correlation here. Guess where Japan is here? Guess where the United States is? Okay. This is also an epidemiological correlation study. Okay, what are some of the problems with this? The Keyes shows rural populations in Italy, Greece, you can read them. The study period was from 1958 to 64. The way he got the data was, for the most part, from national diet data, which he summarized over the whole group of his sample, and then looked at their mortality also from national data. There were several outliers in Yerushalmi's 22 country study. These 8 listed here were all excluded from Keyes' group. 6 of 7 of the Keyes countries were hugely affected by the chaos of World War II during this study period. That meant that there were big-scale immigration, living conditions changed a lot, and the diet also changed a lot. These were all strongly affected and not accounted for by the data. Another odd thing, 13,000 participants in this study in all the different countries. Diet was actually examined beyond the national statistics for only 500. That's 4% of the sample. Here's another interesting observation. Alessandro Menotti was the chief scientist in Italy for the 7 country study. And 25 years after the study was completed, he was interviewed in a follow-up study, and he indicated that the strongest correlation that they actually found in Italy with cardiac mortality was not dietary fat, but sweets. Sweets in their data included refined carbohydrates such as pastries, sugary desserts, pasta, and bread. But sweets did not include other sweet things containing a lot of sugar, like ice cream, chocolate, and soft drinks. Okay, had that been in there, there would almost surely be an even stronger correlation between dietary mortality and sweets. But Renati said that they didn't know what to do with the data because the data did not agree with what we were looking for. So they left it out. Okay. I think that we'll talk about these major studies that don't support the diet heart hypothesis, and then we'll take a break. Very large study called the Framingham Heart Study started in 1948. There were 5,000 subjects initially studied. They did comprehensive physicals and questionnaires about all these different aspects. And then they started following cardiac mortality for this sample. In 1960, 12 years after the start, they found that total serum cholesterol was related to cardiac mortality. This was the first real finding that suggested that that was, in fact, a relationship. This is actually experimental. 30 years later, they have more data. What more data? A lot more people died of cardiac problems. So with that, they went back and looked at the correlations again and made this astonishing finding for men and women with cholesterol between 205 and 264. Serum cholesterol had no relationship to heart disease risk. No relationship. They're taking back that initial finding. What did NIH that funded the study do? They buried it in the basement for 16 years before they finally permitted it to be published. Okay, nurses' health studies run by the Harvard School of Public Health, 1960s and 80s. 116,000 subjects followed for 20 years. They determined that dietary red meat is unrelated to heart disease risk or cancer. There were many other null findings from this nurses' health study. Another remarkable person of this era was Pete Ahrens, who's a biochemist at Rockefeller University. He did real pioneering work on fats and discovering what their structures were and developed new techniques for finding it out. He also then showed that serum triglycerides, those are the VLDL particles, have a strong correlation with heart disease, and it's much better than the total serum cholesterol correlation. I'm going to tell you later about the Mr. Fit study and the LRC studies. These are multi-million-dollar studies at the NIH, and they also gave no support to the diet heart hypothesis. Okay, let's take a little break.
To get back to learning about dietary fat. Take it away, Jean.
Despite all these problems, the 7-country study swept the field, and by the year 2005, there had been over 1 million references to the 7-country study in the medical literature. That's certainly one of the most cited articles then in the history of publication. Meanwhile, he's had a reputation of dealing in a nasty way with criticism. And rather than just make that as a general statement, I'm going to give you a specific example of his reaction to criticism. Raymond Reiser, professor at Texas A&M University, wrote a detailed and rigorous critique of the evidence for the diet heart hypothesis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 1973. Keyes got the journal to accept a 24-page polemic in rebuttal. Any of you that have submitted papers know how difficult that would be to do. How in the world could you get a major journal like that to accept a 24-page rebuttal? I don't know. Well, I'll tell you why in a minute. But here are some 6 quotations. This is from Nina Teicholz's book, of Keyes' criticism of Reiser's paper. Reminds one of the distorting mirrors in the hall of jokes at the county fair. This is a typical distortion. It would be difficult to pack more imprecision in a 16-word sentence. Reiser pompously states. He completely ignores. Obviously, Reiser has no comprehension. These are remarks that are uncalled for in any scientific discussion, or any other for that matter. And it is typical of Keyes to do things like this. The literature is full of stories of people who had the temerity to do scientific studies that disagreed with the diet heart hypothesis, whose careers were destroyed by Ansel Keys. How could he do this? Well, here's why. Keys was very skillful at getting himself into positions of power. So, American Heart Association was founded in 1924 by Paul Dudley White and other cardiac physicians. It was a small group of professionals until about 1948, when the Procter & Gamble Company gave them a grant of $174 million. It's big money in that time. Meanwhile, in 1960, they had grown to 300 chapters and a total budget of $30 million. And in 2015, as you'll see later in an annual report, they are looking at $600 million of education and research expenditures and revenue of $850 million. I wonder where that revenue comes from. Keyes was appointed to the AHA Nutrition Committee in 1960. Okay, so this is a major force in the world, and Keyes is on the crucial committee that is deciding things like research grants to people to study heart disease. And this man has an agenda. Then he also got into the NIH. This is really big money here. National Heart Institute within the NIH was founded, later became the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute that's still there, but it was started in 1948 in the NIH. The current NHLBI research budget is about $2 billion a year, and the NIH total research budget is about $34 billion per year. Between these two agencies, they fund almost all the cardiac research and dietary research in our country. Paul Dudley White, he was the one who became really famous for treating President Eisenhower when he had his heart attacks in 1955 and thereafter. And White was lionized as the genius who fixed Eisenhower. He was the first director of the NHI, the Heart Institute Advisory Council. What does this group do? They're the ones that set policy for the awarding of grants within that outfit. The mantle passed to Keyes in about 1960, so Keyes became the member of this advisory council. That means power. These people have power over other people who apply for research grants to do research. they could say, we don't like the direction that this researcher is going, and deny them a research grant. That's pretty important to you if you're out there in the field. And by about 1975, NIH practically made it official policy that the diet-hard hypothesis is what we do research on, and we don't brook anybody doing research that conflicts with that. Okay? That's where the politics comes in. Okay, this didn't really have too much of an effect until it got into Congress, and George Mcgovern chaired the Senate Select Committee on Malnutrition starting in 1972. They did some pretty good work in the first 4 years. They were focused on malnutrition and programs like food stamps and assistance to poor people for food. 1976, in July, the committee was faced with going out of business because they had done what they needed to do in malnutrition, so they decided that they were going to refocus on dietary excesses in 1976. So they held 2 days of hearings on excesses of diet and disease, and then immediately the staffers wrote and published the dietary goals for the United States. Okay, that's 2 days of hearings. And then they're writing dietary goals for the United States. Furthermore, this staff has no scientific or medical expertise. They went and got Mark Hegstead of the Harvard School of Public Health to be retained as their scientific advisor. So they had one person. I don't know what Hegsted's credentials were, but that didn't move far, but in 1978, the Congress set the U.S. Department of Agriculture as the government lead on nutrition, and Hegstead became the director of the Nutrition Division of the USDA. After 2 years of scientific wrangling in this division over the diet-hard hypothesis and the lack of scientific evidence for it, Hegstead overrode his scientific staff and without endorsement issued in 1980 dietary guidelines for Americans. The basis was provided for the famous food pyramid, which you've all seen. You'll see more of it in a second. In the preface to Dietary Guidelines for Americans, issued by the USDA, Mark Hegstead wrote, "The question is not why we should change our diet, but why not? What are the risks? Important benefits could be expected from this change." Now, this is not science at work, right? This is an agenda that they're pushing through political means. Here's the famous food guide pyramid of the latest iteration of it. It just says, eat lots of this stuff, a little bit less of that, not very much of that, and almost nothing of that. Up here are fats and oils and sweets. That's the only good thing there, is that they're discouraging sweets. The discouragement on fats and oils, no. I remind you that there's no scientific basis for this. Okay, here is what the guidelines stated, roughly. Reduce calories from fat from 40% to 30% of the diet. Reduce calories from saturated fat from 15 to 10%. And if you follow the American Heart Association, they'll take us down to 5. Pretty tough to get to 5. Increase calories from carbohydrates from 50% to 60%. Kept calories from protein at that, but they reduced the protein, especially from red meats. They were largely successful in that because over time those diets did change. and the massive change of things. It started off by, are you cooking with Crisco in 1952? By 1980, that had become pretty much de rigueur in the whole country. Okay, NIH in the 70s and 80s decided to settle the question of the scientific support of the diet art hypothesis with some major studies. First proposed was a $1.3 billion project, but that was rejected as too expensive and too risky. As even they could see, maybe we won't get there with this, so let's not invest all our money in it. So they did two smaller studies. These were not very small. One called Mr. FIT, but that acronym stands for Multiple Risk Factors Intervention Trial. 9 years, $115 million. It measured serum cholesterol for a bunch of people, found 12,000 with very high serum cholesterol. They counseled half to behave, to quit smoking, to take medicines, and eat a low-fat, low cholesterol diet. That would be also high carbohydrate diet. And the controls were not treated. At 7 years, they looked at the results of this intervention and found negative results. The control group did better than the treatment group. That's inconvenient for the NIH. They buried those results also, and we didn't hear about Mr. Fit for about 8 years after they completed it. Another odd thing is that the behaviors in the treatment group actually did change. Okay, this is the other big study, so-called LRC, Lipid Research Clinic Coronary Primary Prevention Trial. You can read about it there. They counseled both the experimental and control groups to both eat a low-fat, low-cholesterol, high-carbohydrate diet, but they administered a drug, covasterol, which is an early statin-type drug, to the controls. Excuse me. That should be to the experimental group, not the controls. Okay, diet in this study was not tested. So when they got done, they just barely found a statistically significant. They had to go through the statistics a couple times and do a couple of different statistical models until they finally found that they could get a statistically significant correlation, which showed that this drug did in fact lower serum cholesterol. So NIH celebrated that as a success, proving that reduction of serum cholesterol reduces cardiac risk. But they inferred that then any lowering of cholesterol with the drug is equivalent to lowering it with diet. Okay, there isn't any great mystery about what eating fats of different kinds does to your blood lipids, despite everything you read from the American Heart Association. This is a Dutch group headed by this man Mensing, published in 2003. This is a meta-analysis of 60 controlled studies that were already in the literature. So they went to the literature and found 60 studies that met their criteria for this. They are feeding experiments that substituted fats of different types for dietary carbohydrate, while holding total dietary energy and total cholesterol in the diet constant. Blood lipids were determined after weeks of feeding to ascertain the total to HDL cholesterol ratio. This, by the way, is reference 4 from the AHA Presidential Advisory. This is the indication of blood lipids that Mensing used, and he discusses the LDL one, but points out that that's an inferior measure of blood lipid risk for heart attacks, then you should be using this ratio. Apparently, people at the American Heart Association didn't notice that. Instead, they attributed to Mensink the claim that the LDL cholesterol is a leading cause of atherosclerosis and that dietary fat increases that. Well, more about that a little bit later. Here's what happens. You put in saturated fat and substitute it for carbohydrates in the diet, you do get a change in the total cholesterol divided by the HDL cholesterol ratio, and it's very tiny in the wrong direction. So you're slightly worse off doing that substitution. If you use cis unsac, those are the natural ones, you get a big boost in the correct direction. If you use polyunsaturated fats, you get an even bigger boost in the right direction. But if you use trans unsaturated fats, you go in the wrong direction big time. Okay, so I said there isn't any mystery about this. This is a really big study, very carefully controlled. You shouldn't gainsay this and pretend that we don't know or that saturated fat in the diet is bad for you. Huh? No. Okay, here's the presidential advisory, page 1 of the text, and you probably can't read it, but in here it says the scientific rationale, that's the part I quoted. Okay, and you can read along there. Is based on well-established effects of saturated fat to raise LDL. Yeah, Mensink actually said that, but then he said, this is irrelevant because saturated fats increase HDL more than they increase LDL. And then it cuts to this being a leading cause of atherosclerosis. Well, yes, if you take it out all by itself, it would mean that, but that's not what Mensink had to say. In fact, it's just a lie about what Mensink is doing. So to attribute that to reference 4 is a piece of artful lying. Gary Taubes, in his Soft Science article in Science, has a wonderful paragraph that I think is worth repeating about the effects of eating a porterhouse steak. You probably know porterhouse is a well-marbled, fatty beef steak. It's sinful. Everyone knows that they're sinful. So here, let's look at the result of sin. Taubes says about 45% of the fat in that steak is saturated. About a third of it is stearic acid. This results in a slight reduction of total HD to HDL cholesterol. It's a very, very slight move in the right direction, mainly because of the stearic acid. 51% is monounsaturated, that's oleic acid, think olive oil. That produces a large reduction, and 4% is polyunsaturated fat, further reduction. So, conclusion, cardiac health is improved by eating a porterhouse steak. Okay, one other connected matter is the statin drugs, and I put it up there as a bonanza. About 25 million Americans, or about a third of those over 65, are taking statin drugs at a cost of about $20 billion per year. Statins lower LDL, but they don't affect total mortality. They're probably an effect on cardiac mortality, but then other kinds of mortality creep in. So you have blood pressure effect, effect due to increased diabetes, increased stroke. Several things that go on. When you get a large sample of people, you can see these side effects. the overall effect is that total mortality is not affected by taking the statin. Talk to your doctor level, in about 1985 when they first started, was about 240. These are total cholesterols. Today it's been moved down to 200, and the AHA is pushing 180. So we have about 50 million people that are eligible to have a statin prescribed for them right now. And if it goes down to 180, it's going to go up to about 80 million. Who do you think is in favor of that? Actual American Heart Association guidelines state that a statin should be discussed with your doctor for persons of normal risk, age 40 to 75, with LDL from 70 to 189. The normal LDL range is between 75% or more of people is 90 to 160. This is almost meaningless. It's saying consider a statin if you have any measurable LDL level. Okay, AHA guidelines actually do not mention HDL, nor this total to HDL ratio. Now your doctor, if he or she is sensible, would of course pay attention to that, but the AHA does not. This is from Taube's article, and it is a fascinating graph. Sorry, the quality of it isn't so high. But for men and women, looking at total risk ratio, that's mortality, versus total blood cholesterol. Notice between, it's a little hard to say what these numbers are, but that's probably about 180, and this is probably about 240 or so. That in here, the risk mortality with total blood cholesterol is virtually flat. That's the treatment range for statins, and it looks like nothing's going on. Look at women. Holy cow. Here, their mortality risk goes down at higher cholesterol levels, and it's virtually flat all the way up to 240 here. You can breathe now. It's just amazing. Okay, here is from the annual report of the American Heart Association in 2015, showing their revenues and their expenses. Crucial thing are these revenues, so they got about $250 million in contributions, and then these things, net special events, even more, $1/3 billion. I think that is primarily from large companies. And you can look and determine from even the annual report that all the big drug companies and the big food companies are contributors to the AHA. And all they have to say is that if they give more than $1 million or up to $1 million, they have to be listed. And so you can tell from that there are $1 million a year contributions coming from at least 25 of these big companies. How much else is going in there, it's hard to say. Notice that their research and so-called education and training budget is pretty high. There's a lot of research money coming from the American Heart Association. But then, think again, who's interested in this research? Well, the donors are pretty interested in that. And I think that indicates that this agency is not on the side of the angels. I thought it was for a long time, but now I think, no, they are deeply compromised. Okay, there are a few signs of hope here. Time in February 8th, 2016, published 4 pages on the new rules of the heart. And here's what they say. You can stop worrying about cholesterol in foods. Whew. glad to hear that. What's that? That was 60 years ago that Ansel Keys established that we didn't need to worry about that. Get your doctor to pay more attention to HDL than LDL. Reduce cardiovascular damage from VLDLs, those are the ones that have triglycerides in them, by avoiding sugar and refined carbohydrates. And last, saturated fat is actually good for your health. Okay, in April last year said, new findings about full-fat dairy. Refer article. It says, a new study shows that full-fat dairy reduces the risk of diabetes by 46%. That's another pretty significant development. Why? If the calories of full-fat dairy are avoided with low or no-fat dairy, the calories are replaced by carbohydrates, and these contribute to syndrome X. So that's my story. I need to point out that the political science part of this could be thought insulting by a practitioner of that discipline. But I'd like to explain a little bit. As a scientist, I find this a dismal history. I may be doing political science a disservice with my title, but I don't mean to. As my colleague Luther Erickson has long maintained, in science, theory guides and experiment decides. I think that little couplet is very profound. This means that in science, dogma or theory must not go without testing based on experiment. I suspect that political science, the real thing, if it's working, also should not let dogma go without testing in the body politic. The diet-hard hypothesis has escaped scientific and political tests for 60 years because those that knew the truth were powerful, and they were very interested in keeping the matter secret. So, friends, my advice is to eat more meat, eat full-fat dairy and eggs, stay away from trans fat, eat as little refined carbohydrate as possible, grill your doctor about whether or not you should be taking a statin. And if you do these things, you're likely to live a longer, healthier, happier, and more prosperous life. Thank you. So I think we have a little time for questions. John?
For those of us who have relatives who we think ought to be seeing this, how do we get a copy? Not necessarily view.
YouTube.
John's-
Look at YouTube.
YouTube. Thank you.
I think he signed the paper.
Okay, in terms of the dairy, how does, from your scientific understanding, how does dairy intolerance figure into lactose intolerance?
Okay, well, she's asking about how does lactose intolerance figure into the observations about diet? Well, the answer to that is simple. It's a different thing than anything I've talked about here. And lactose intolerance is a separate matter, and if you have it, then you need to pay attention to that. Elliot.
Even as a biochemist, I found so many pieces of advice on how to switch from the old way, what you and I were brought up with, to your revised standards. Wouldn't it be simpler just to construct and publicize the Wubbels food pyramid?
I think most of you heard that. Elliot is suggesting that we construct something called the Wubbels food pyramid. I think I would not be a candidate to do that, but maybe You should do that,
Oh,
Elliot.
I can't remember this time too. But you said that this is certifiable on the right side of the argument. The cover story for November.
Yeah, for the most part, that's true. Elliot's holding up a copy of Consumer Reports. They have a lengthy section here on food in this, and Elliot loaned me that to read. And I endorse it. I think it's accurate. One of the best things they do in there is to emphatically reject the idea of eating refined carbohydrates. And I think that's very good advice.
In the interest of full disclosure, in being from Nebraska, do you have an agenda that you were would amend to, or is this unbiased?
No, I have no agenda. The question is, I'm from Nebraska the last 20 years, and maybe I brought an agenda to this. I claim innocence on that score. No, I don't have one. I would say that I'm insulted by this history as a scientist. This is really revolting as an illustration of science. And it's, can hardly believe that public affairs have been so misguided here. And I don't think that this is just a matter of conjecture or a trivial thing. I think that the 100 million Americans that suffer from syndrome X, I do think that's related to this massive change of diets and the false science on which it was based.
What is refined carbohydrate?
Sugars, anything that has sugar in it. Oh, Jack is, thank you. Jack's asking, what is a refined carbohydrate? There are two principal kinds, any sugars. And the other kind is refined flour. So white flour that has had the hulls removed and is found in pasta and breads and the like. Anything you use white flour for will have refined carbohydrates.
Thank you.
How in the world are you ever going to know whether to believe any research now?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Question is, how can we believe any research that we hear about? One of the best ways to decide whether or not to believe it is if you can find out who's paying them.
Yeah.
Okay? Because who's paying them often is the reason. If there's a vested interest,
Where the money follows money.
sometimes it's hard to discover, I admit, but if there's a vested interest, then you'll know. Emily.
Should we avoid especially sweet fruits? Because, I mean, it's not sugar as we talked about, but
Yep.
fruits and vegetables are recommended by everybody, I mean, by you, I think.
Emily's asking whether we should avoid sweet fruits. If they're whole fruits, then the glycemic index of those is low, even though they have the same sugar in them that you get from your sugar container. The reason that that's different is the fiber in the fruit. So typically fruits contain soluble fiber and insoluble fiber, and the soluble fiber actually sticks to the sugar that's there, and it goes all the way through your digestive tract, mostly without getting into your bloodstream. And finally, in your large colon, the bugs in there will degrade that soluble fiber and release the sugar. It's very slow to release if there's fiber with it. I'm getting the time signal from Joanne, so thank you very much.
We want to thank Jean so much for coming today and teaching us all that we didn't know. Before you leave today, remember to turn off your tea coil and turn on your cell phones. Come back next Wednesday when we welcome Bill Pollock, who will be talking to us on automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, what jobs will be left for us. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week.